So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Shatabhisha Shetty. I am the director of the Asia Pacific Leadership Network. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar at the Crossroads, the Climate-Nuclear-Geopolitical Nexus in the Pacific. Today, we will explore the complex interplay of climate change, past and present nuclear policies and practices, and the current geopolitical dynamics in the Pacific. For those of you who may not be familiar with the APLN, we are an independent organization, a network of over 150 leadership figures from 22 countries across the region, focusing on addressing defense and security challenges, and particularly nuclear weapons risks. Over the past 2 years, with support from the Ploughshares Fund, APLN has been running a project that aims to amplify voices from the Pacific and highlight the inequities and injustices of past and present nuclear weapons policies and practices that exacerbate existential risks, including the climate crisis. Today, together with individuals, organizations, and civil society groups across the Pacific, we have worked to raise awareness of the need to address the human and environmental security challenges in the region. Throughout the project, APLN has engaged with experts and scholars from the Pacific, some of whom we will hear from today, to produce analytical papers and reflective essays on a range of topics pertaining to nuclear legacies, climate vulnerabilities, and regional security debates. We have also organized events featuring Pacific perspectives at regional and international security fora, including running a side event at the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons Treaty second meeting in New York at the end of last year. For this event today, we are discussing a recently published report authored by APLN Policy Fellows Dr. Tanvi Kulkarni and Elaine Natalie, in which they discuss the main findings from this project so far, focusing on 6 key themes: the threat of the climate nuclear security nexus, the impact of the US-China rivalry on Pacific solidarity and foreign policy, the need for greater representation of Pacific perspectives, the importance of nuclear justice and how it should be pursued, how to build trust and engagement across the region, and the crucial role of women fighting for a nuclear-free Pacific. Originally, Tanvi Kulkarni was intending to make the main presentation on the report. However, due to an urgent matter, she's unable to join us today, and instead, Elaine Natalie will give the presentation. Elaine's overview of the report will be followed by presentations from 2 of the Pacific experts who have been involved in this project. First, we have Patrick Kaiku, a teaching fellow in the political science strand at the University of Papua New Guinea, where he has been teaching since 2011. Patrick's research interests include Pacific politics and diplomacy, and he is also the author of one of the project's papers entitled Nuclear Justice for the Marshall Islands in the Age of Geopolitical Rivalry in the Pacific. Next, we have Maima Koro, Pacific Research Fellow for the Regional Perspectives Project at the University of Adelaide. Hailing from Tokelau and Samoa, Maima has over 20 years of international development experience in the Pacific at national and regional levels. She's also pursuing a PhD focusing on the intersection of security and justice in Pacific communities. Maima also authored another of our project papers entitled Relational Security, Ethical Dilemmas of Geopolitics in the Blue Pacific Continent. And she was also one of the panelists at our TPNW side event on strengthening a nuclear-free Pacific region. Following these 2 presentations, we will have comments from 2 experts from the region. First, we have Dr. Theresa Arriola, Assistant Professor at Concordia University in Montreal, where she teaches about militarism, Indigenous sovereignty, and the socio-political realities of Oceania more broadly. Born and raised in the Northern Mariana Islands, Isa's encounters with military personnel in her youth inspired her to learn more about the role of the Marianas in the context of United States imperialism and militarism. And last but not least, we have Dr. Joanne Wallis, Professor of International Security in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Adelaide. She is also the Research Director of the Security in the Pacific Islands Programme in the Stretton Institute at the University of Adelaide and a non-resident Senior Fellow of the Brookings Institution. Joanne is the author or editor of 10 books, including Pacific Power, Australia's Strategy in the Pacific Islands. After the remarks from our discussants, we will open the floor for comments and questions. Please feel free to add any comments or questions you have in the Q&A box, and we will seek to address them during the open floor discussion. And with that, I will now hand it over to Elaine Natalie for the main report presentation. Elaine.
Thank you, Shada. And I'll just, okay, yeah, my slides. Okay, thanks, Fang. Okay, so before I begin, I want to acknowledge that while I am one of the co-leads of this project, I'm not from the Pacific region myself. However, through this project, I've had the privilege of closely collaborating with and learning from experts and scholars from the Pacific, including Patrick and Maima, who will also be sharing their insights with us today. And so our recently published project report titled Navigating Nuclear Legacies, Climate Change, and Geopolitics in the Pacific Islands aims to synthesize the ideas and insights gathered over the past 2 years. We have gathered these insights from the publications, events, and conversations we've had with scholars from or based in the Pacific Islands and Oceania. Throughout this, our project, we've worked to include multiple and diverse perspectives from the region. And so the analysis in this report basically draws upon those perspectives. So in this report, we identify and discuss 6 key themes that have emerged from our 2-year project. Which are the climate-nuclear-security nexus in the Pacific, the impact of US-China rivalry on the Pacific, nuclear justice for Pacific communities, understanding Pacific perspectives, building trust and engagement, and the role of women in fighting for a nuclear-free Pacific. So this is a lot to cover in 7 minutes, and I believe Patrick and Maima will delve deeper into the climate-nuclear-security nexus, geopolitical dynamics, and nuclear justice aspects in their presentations. So I'll be focusing my remarks today on just 2 themes in particular: understanding Pacific perspectives and building trust and engagement. I'll then conclude by highlighting some of the overarching conclusions and proposed next steps that we've drawn from this project. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the reasons why this project initially came about was that even as great power competition and the worsening climate crisis bring renewed focus to the Pacific region, Pacific Island voices remain poorly represented within wider regional and global security conversations, including within APLN. So as much as this project has aimed to engage and promote voices from the Pacific, it has also been an opportunity for us to learn more about and cultivate a deeper understanding of Pacific perspectives. Pacific communities have actively resisted nuclear testing and colonialism for decades, leading in nuclear disarmament as well as climate change advocacy. They have expressed their resistance in many forms, including politically, legally, artistically, to bring justice to the nuclear legacy issues they continue to face today. So some of the most notable Pacific initiatives and efforts include the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific Movement, or the NFIP, the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone, or the Treaty of Rarotonga, and innumerable resistance movements led by women, youth, and various Pacific communities. But despite this foundational role in global disarmament efforts, Pacific scholars have pointed out that Pacific decolonial perspectives and efforts are at risk of being overlooked as Western narratives dominate. Pacific perspectives are also often presented as narratives of the vulnerable and the weak, undermining their agency and devaluing their contribution to international security debates. The National Nuclear Commission of Marshall Islands has specifically warned against this in their ethics protocol for nuclear legacy researchers, urging the international community to avoid one-dimensional portrayals of the Marshallese people as victims that harm efforts to bolster resilience and self-reliance. Pacific leaders and scholars are actively seeking to frame their own narratives in global security debates and discourse, highlighting the strengths and richness of the Pacific and its peoples, including their knowledge, cultures, practices, values, and beliefs that help in countering the Anthropocene. So according to scholar Tarcisius Kabutalaka, the Blue Pacific concept as a foundation for collective regional identity and cooperation is a counter-narrative to traditional conceptions of Pacific regionalism and a strategy to counter the dominance of global powers in the region. So non-Pacific countries, especially those vying for geopolitical influence in the Pacific, such as the US, China, and their allies, should deepen their understanding of and relationships with Pacific communities to help build the region through collaborative empowerment and consultation as equal partners before making decisions that impact Pacific countries and their communities. So instead of asking Pacific countries to make binary geopolitical decisions, they should acknowledge and support the security priorities of the region, particularly in fighting the impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. And our insights on building trust and engagement basically builds on this understanding of Pacific perspectives. And as Pacific scholars, including Patrick and Maima, have pointed out throughout our project, it is important to create opportunities for Pacific nations to engage in internal dialogues with their people and regionally with their leaders to realize their shared vision of a blue Pacific continent characterized by security, stability, and prosperity. So this includes promoting conversations on issues such as the climate-nuclear security nexus, nuclear justice, and the escalating geopolitical tensions within the Pacific region. And by framing these issues regionally, more partners and states within the Pacific can lend weight to the cause. And these conversations need to involve not only experts, but also general public and various communities, because at a time when nuclear armed powers and their allies are competing for geopolitical influence in the Pacific, it is especially important for everyone to be well informed. So scholarly papers and contributions from Pacifica experts originally intended for academic or policy audiences should be simplified into more accessible formats. And we ourselves have endeavored to do this throughout our project by publishing infographics based on expert papers and scholarly debates. Additionally, in our conversations with Pacific experts, broadening the dialogue to include counterparts in Asia was also suggested, and this would involve fostering closer cooperation and engagement among Pacific and Asian experts, policy practitioners, and civil society groups to explore collaborative solutions and identify opportunities to address worsening nuclear and climate risks, the consequences of great power competition, and other shared security concerns in an attempt to future-proof the Asia-Pacific region. The lack of Pacific representation in regional and international security forums not only results in overlooked Pacific perspectives, but also deprives Pacific experts of opportunities to directly engage with and learn about the broader Asia-Pacific region and its various security priorities. And during the signing of an intersecretariat MOU between ASEAN and the Pacific Islands Forum in September of last year, Indonesian Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi emphasized the importance of cooperation between ASEAN and countries in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. She highlighted the interconnectedness of the Asia Pacific, noting that what happens in the region will likely affect us all, and stressing the need to strengthen cooperation across various areas of common interests, including climate change and maritime issues. And this MOU marks a promising start of collaboration between the Pacific and Asia, but further collaboration at the working and operational level will be necessary to foster trust and understanding and to advocate for concrete actions. Next slide, please. So to conclude, there is a critical need to deepen engagement and collaboration within the Pacific Islands while also expanding the dialogue across the wider Asia-Pacific region. People-to-people exchanges and track-to diplomatic platforms can serve as valuable mediums for coordinating like-minded actors and stakeholders across the Asia-Pacific, bypassing sometimes reluctant official government channels of interactions. So central to this effort is the continued empowerment of Pacific voices, emphasizing their agency and perspectives in global conversations on security. And this also means that engagement of non-Pacific states with the Pacific must be based on an understanding of the priorities of the Pacific. And moving forward, a solutions-based approach must be adopted while addressing security concerns across the Pacific region, going beyond the mere identification of challenges to foster actionable strategies. Moreover, bridging the dialogue gap between Pacific Island nations and their Asian counterparts is crucial to comprehensively address shared nuclear, climate, geopolitical, and other security risks in the Asia Pacific. So through sustained efforts in trust building and dialogue, we believe that meaningful progress towards mitigating these various existential threats can be achieved, promoting the security of the Pacific Islands and broader Asia Pacific region. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. I will hand straight over to Patrick Kaiku for his presentation. Patrick. Oh, you have to unmute yourself, Patrick. There we go.
Thank you, Olga. My apologies if I'm all over the place with my presentation. It's going to be 7 minutes. This issue for me, the nuclear climate geopolitical nexus is an interesting matter, and it actually my role as an academic in Papua New Guinea is to educate my fellow Papua New Guineans about these issues. I'll introduce by giving my positionality as a Papua New Guinean. Speaking as a Papua New Guinean, firstly, most of the issues that affect our region, it seems that most generations, younger generations of Papua New Guineans don't necessarily understand a lot about what's happening in the wider region. I teach South Pacific politics, and my first exercise is to try to familiarize my students about the region. Most of my students cannot even locate the Marshall Islands or French Polynesia on the unlabeled map that I give them. So I'm starting from a position of trying to understand and how Papua New Guineans and some of the bigger countries in the western part of the Pacific, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, can be part of this understanding or educating themselves about the issues within the region. We claim to be Pacific Islanders, but a lot of Papua New Guineans and Melanesians may not necessarily know what where the Pacific is, or what are the issues in the Pacific. So I think that's to do with my position. Writing about the issue of Marshall Islands and the legacies of nuclear testing, the important thing for me here was trying to understand the role of humanizing Melanesian Marshallese culture, language, and identity. I looked at the idea of compensation and reparations, and there is emphasis on monetary and tangible monetary value put to justice. But as I argued in the discussion paper that I wrote, Nuclear Justice for the Marshall Islands, it has more to do with also the psychological as well as the cultural and the identity aspect of Marshall Island society and all Pacific Island societies. This is, I think, the important point that academia has to do, and I think scholarship and cross-cultural learning between Pacific Island academics is going to put a lot of Pacific-oriented and Pacific-centered perspectives that may not necessarily be where Western-oriented scholarship is coming from. The other issue for me was the issues that Pacific Islanders are individually confronting can be illuminated for a regional audience if there are convergence and platforms for interactions. I cite the case here of the recent recently concluded Pacific Islands Pacific Festival of Arts and Culture. That is a very useful kind of platform where the whole Pacific Islands is concentrated, and issues such as nuclear testing and decolonization movements in New Caledonia or West Papua are raised. We don't usually have annual events that are useful platforms for the awareness and for generating information and sharing of information about issues that affect us. And I think that goes back to how after the 1980s and 1990s, when a lot of these Pacific Island countries became independent, we just fell back into our states and our countries, and the idea of regionalism and anti-nuclear movement just dissipated as a result. And so I think there is the platforms that are available for increased interactions and sharing of ideas is limited in that context. I will move on to the body of this discussion, and I think in the article that was done, Nuclear Justice for the Marshall Islands, I left out two important points. The decolonization process. The first important point of observation that I think I did not really go into detail with the discussion was the unfinished business of decolonization in the Pacific Islands. By decolonization, I do not necessarily mean the fulfilling the requisite fundamental rights of self-determination, such as the current West Papua and New Caledonia and French Polynesia struggle for independence. Decolonization, yeah, what I mean is the reasserting of the humanity and self-reliance of cultures in the Pacific. And now my reading of the National Nuclear Commission Strategy for Coordinated Action, the NNC strategy of the Marshall Islands, I picked out that there's implicitly an attempt by Marshall Islands here to decolonize, to try to break away from the overdependence on American patronage. So in the nuclear justice space of the Marshall Islands, and the attempt to talk about nuclear justice, there is here an implicit focus on decolonizing, to break out of the overdependence on American patronage and being too dependent and reliant on the United States. So that I think is one of the points I did not necessarily go into detail with that report. But also, when you look at geopolitical maneuverings in the Pacific as well, the so-called China-United States rivalry, there are also language of decolonization or self-reliance or sovereignty expressed, the so-called friends to all and enemies to none, foreign policy orientation. It is used by Pacific Island states in trying to assert agency and some sense of independence in their dealing with major powers in the region. Friends to all and enemies to none, or the non-aligned foreign policy orientation, is an example of states trying to remain independent and autonomous in areas such as foreign policy. So it allows for them, Pacific Island states, to advocate on issues that are of importance to them. So if we look at the case of Papua New Guinea, if it is not so dependent on Australian foreign aid, Papua New Guinea will be able to assert independence and talk more about Australian, exporting of coal as one of the contributing factors to the carbon emissions that's directly connected to sea level rise and climate change on the planet. So that could be another way of looking at decolonization. It's not necessarily about self-determination and getting independence for states, but also asserting autonomy in this current situation, dealing with this nexus of issues. The second point that I wanted to make, and I did not necessarily spend significant time in the article or the discussion paper, was the detrimental effect of geopolitical rivalry in the Pacific, especially building collective diplomacy as a means of dealing with issues like climate change or the effects of nuclear testing. One of the things that I've observed in the Melanesian sub-region of the Pacific is, Solomon Islands is seen to be ostracized. Now, Solomon Islands is a major exporter of timber, and it has a role to play, especially in the conversations about climate change. But how it has, in the last term of parliament of Sogovare, been, establishing very strong, there seems to be the perception that the Solomon Islands is too much in the influence of China, and therefore ostracized and isolated and seems like a pariah. How can regional solidarity around issues like climate change and nuclear justice be pursued if geopolitical divisiveness creates a very antagonistic and confrontational, situation in the Pacific? So states in the Pacific, small states especially, if they are aligned with any of these major geopolitical powers, it can create suspicions and animosity that is not necessarily useful for collective diplomacy to be facilitated. I think those are the major 2 points that I thought would have been covered in the article. My final set of discussions would be around recommendations, and I think that going forward, so much has already been written, and people like Nick McClellan, they talk very much and they write very much about the 1970s and 1980s, the Free Nuclear Pacific movement. These are some of there's so much rich material and rich sources of areas that we can work on to generate the kind of regional consciousness about issues affecting the region. My suspicion is that after independence, we all fell back into our little cocoons, that this 1970s and 1980s mindset of regional coordination and cooperation and the regional consciousness actually just died out as a result. The states became independent, we went into nation building mode, and the idea of regional issues like decolonization, nuclear justice, and geopolitical rivalry took a back burner whilst everybody started concentrating on their own domestic issues. So this particular platform that APLN is setting up, coordinating and actually getting scholars in the Pacific to link up is perhaps a useful platform going forward. I think I'll just leave my presentation here and we'll talk more about this in the next part of the discussion.
Thank you, Patrick, for that very thoughtful and excellent presentation. I will hand straight over to Maima Koro. Maima, please.
Thank you, and thank you, Patrick, for your presentation. Very hard to follow that, I must say. Well, okay. Malo soifua o levi inga de to watato o lia mai fo ile nei whamoi moi tawa. I want to thank the organizers for this important conversation. At the heart of our conversation today, it's about people. So just to kind of reinforce some of the discussions that have been already made, I thought I'd start with a quick summary of the Pacific context just to set the scene. The Pacific does span across a unique and diverse and also a very dynamic region from north to south of the Pacific Ocean. Following colonization, the region was carved up into 3 sub-regions. We know that from it's called Melanesia, Micronesia, and also Polynesia, where I am from. It is home to more than 1,500 different communities with distinct languages, different social structures, norms, and beliefs. And of course, the population, some say small, ranges from 1,500 to 9 million. And the development stages of Pacific countries, they differ. However, within its diversity, there are commonalities. And this has been the cornerstone of the collective wisdom that Pacific people have taken in terms of trying to address the issues we are discussing today. For example, our value systems are similar. It is hierarchical, it's faith-based communities. We have strong cultures and traditions. The islands are remote, but definitely connected by the world's largest ocean. The region is home to substantial natural resources, and Pacific countries are some of the most vulnerable in the world to the effects of climate change. Whilst Pacific countries and people acknowledge their challenges, Pacific countries also continue to celebrate the richness and uniqueness of their heritage, and that is very important. So in such a diverse and dynamic space, how do Pacific countries deal with the issues we're dealing with today? And what are their views in terms of geopolitics? The main geopolitical debate that currently exists in this region relates to the competition between the United States and China for power or influence in the Pacific, however that is defined. The geopolitical debate highlights the differences, in my view, of the priorities, values, beliefs, and traditions of Pacific countries from those of the major powers. The first point I would like to make is that Pacific understandings of geopolitics do not translate neatly into Western ones. As such, an understanding of Pacific worldviews may explain their perspectives of the geopolitics. In 2023, we published a paper with Professor Joanne Wallis, pleased to see online, arguing for a reframing of geopolitics in the Pacific. Pacific people's worldviews are cyclic in that all life, the land, the ocean, and the species and the heaven is relationally interconnected, integrated, and codependent. This relational codependency is governed by multiple protocols with multi-layered cultures and traditions. These protocols vary across the Pacific context and underpin all relationships, including international politics and foreign policy. In 2018, the former Prime Minister of Samoa stated the Pacific region may appear as small dots on world maps, but they are situated in a large strategic area. From a Pacific perspective, this large strategic area goes beyond the ocean. It includes people, their ancestors, their land, and their cosmological beliefs. Contrary to Western narratives of Pacific as small, isolated, fragile, and vulnerable islands, Pacific people understand Pacific states, in the words of the Tuvalu Foreign Affairs Minister, the largest oceanic continent in the world, with the ocean connecting cultures, identities, resources, and development aspirations. The reframing of Pacific countries as large ocean states was inspired by Tonga academic, the late Dr. Hauofa Epeli, whose vision of a substantial regional identity based on Pacific people's common inheritance, the Pacific Ocean, is largely now being accepted. It is a positioning of the collective power of the Pacific states. It is therefore not a surprise that in 2017, Pacific leaders formalized this positioning as the one blue Pacific identity for the region, and continue to emphasize the need for regional solidarity in view of the increasing geostrategic interest in the Pacific. The Blue Pacific narrative of large ocean states with shared values is a powerful unifier for Pacific countries, as despite the diversity and nuances of the region, the ocean represents shared values and interconnects Pacific people. It is from this perspective that Pacific people and governments have relentlessly pursued the fight against climate change, as well as the nuclear legacy issues. For example, the stewardship of the Pacific Elders' Voice, the Pacific Conference of Churches, the amazing work by the Pacific Island students fighting climate change, as well as the Pacific Network on Globalization, to name a few. Last month, the Samoa Prime Minister, Awhiongawhia Me Naomi Ta'afa, stated, and I quote, "Pacific leaders have already declared that Pacific communities are facing a climate emergency, threatening livelihoods, security, and the well-being of people and the ecosystems. The fear of the impact of the climate crisis and the impact of the colonial nuclear legacy on Pacific communities. It's not a perceived threat. It is real." These beliefs were reaffirmed in the 2018 when Pacific leaders declared climate change as the single greatest threat to the region under the Boy Declaration. And as articulated by former Fiji military commander Rear Admiral Viliame Naboto at a regional conference in 2019. There are currently 3 major powers in competition in the Pacific region. Of the 3, climate change is winning and exerts the most influence on countries in the Pacific Islands region. And this is confirmed by the findings of a research we conducted in Vanuatu. We are about to publish that report. The research examined Vanuatu communities' perception of security and vulnerabilities, including international relationships with external partners. The majority of the participants shared their stories about the effects of climate change. It was a pressing as they were still dealing with the aftermath of an unprecedented twin cyclone, TC Kevin and also Cyclone Judy. Both were categorized as level 4 cyclones that devastated the country in March last year and prompted the government to declare a state of emergency. At the opening of the 4th Pacific Ocean Pacific Climate Change Conference last month in Samoa, the Prime Minister rightly stated in her opening statement that dealing with the impacts of natural disasters is the continued lived reality of Pacific countries. And addressing climate change has been a fight for Pacific countries for over 40 years. Geopolitics is traditionally about military and economic power influence. And I guess the second point I would like to emphasize is that the term of power or influence in the Pacific is an evolving concept. In the diversity of Pacific environments, the context, for example, means different things to different people and to different community. Power and influence is multidimensional, and it is the quality of the relationships based on humility and respect, rather than material things such as infrastructure projects that external partners build, that remains the currency of influence. In this geopolitical climate, the impact of the colonial nuclear legacy and colonial wars is very prominent in the minds of Pacific people. And again, to be very clear, these threats are real. They are not perceived. While some countries view nuclear weapons as a deterrent, the reality is that in this region, there are communities that are still living with the nuclear legacy of the colonial powers. In February, during an interview with Radio New Zealand, the Cook Islands, Samoa, and Tonga leaders reaffirmed their stance for the Pacific to remain a nuclear-free zone. Pacific leaders last year discussed a review of the 1985 Rarotonga Treaty, especially in view of recent developments, such as AUKUS, the Fukushima issue, and the state of the nuclear waste disposal in Marshall Islands. During the New Zealand Foreign Affairs Minister's visit to Samoa in February this year, the Prime Minister reminded New Zealand of its obligations as a signatory to the Rarotonga Treaty. In her words, as a region that has been impacted by nuclear threat and still ongoing, especially in the Marshall Islands and in Tahiti, we do not want the Pacific to become an area where people will take license for nuclear arrangements. The third point is that geopolitics is viewed by Pacific people as an unnecessary distraction to the real development of their countries and also their security priorities. Climate change has exacerbated Pacific countries' development challenges as they are continually stuck in the phase of rebuilding. And my final point is that Pacific countries view the geopolitical competition in both present and historical contexts. As such, the crucial point for making decision or the point of reference for policy and decision makers must start with the people. Pacific people's cyclic worldviews do not consider the past, the present, and the future as linear time zones. And I'm mindful of time. I just want to emphasize that in the Pacific, solidarity and unity is really about, that is the strategy for countering geopolitical concentration. And the main foreign policy is friends to all and enemies to none. No one country can secure the Pacific. And it is simple arrogance and ignorance to even consider that one or a few partners have solutions for Pacific countries. The Pacific's development journey has confirmed that freedom has many faces. Solidarity and unity remain a core strategy, with friends to all and enemies to none as the common foreign policy. Collaboration, dialogue have been the consistent mechanisms advocated by Pacific countries in managing geopolitical competition. These are the shared values of the Pacific Way. We need to focus on reducing harm on our Earth planet. And to conclude, Pacific countries have, do, and will focus on their physical, economic, and social survival. Geopolitics has provided opportunities for Pacific countries, in my view, to re-examine their own democracies, reinvest in their own practices, customs, and knowledge system, and collaborate with partners in their own ways. Whaftai Maia. Thank you.
Thank you, Maima. That was a very thought-provoking and an excellent presentation. We appreciate your comments and your insights. I'll now hand over to the first of our two discussants, our two commentators. First up, we'll have Isa Arriola. Isa.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Okay. Hi, thank you so much, Maima and Patrick, for your excellent presentations and for laying the groundwork. I'll try to do my best to kind of sum up with some comments. But before I do, and also thank you to the organizers of this event for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I'm very honored to be here. I just wanted to point out a little bit about my positionality and where I am. I am an assistant professor at Concordia University, but I'm currently on my home island of Saipan in the Northern Mariana Islands. And I do a lot of community work to educate, do research, and bring awareness to the local community about military planning on our islands, which we are in desperate need of as military planning continues unabated. And I'll talk about that very briefly here today. So after hearing both Patrick and Maima's remarks today, I'm reminded of the ways that we are really working to think beyond and to really resist the binary thinking between this notion of allegiance between either China or the United States. a binary we really have grown accustomed to thinking is natural in our part of the world a lot of times, and are sometimes taught to accept as the only way of thinking about geopolitics and our position on the globe. And so I want to also recognize that we are currently in the midst of reframing and renegotiating the role of the security discourse and really wrestling with the implications of the word security itself and its application by world powers in the Pacific. The holistic and cyclical nature of power in many Pacific cultures, as Maima describes, has always and continues to shift the dominant narratives about our people's futures. From my perspective in the Northern Mariana Islands, we see the critical role of media literacy in unpacking pro-militarization, pro-war rhetoric, and a growing sense of really confusion regarding the actuality and the potentiality of threats to our islands, since fear of attacks from China and North Korea have become guiding political factors in geopolitical decision-making many times. I recently came back from the Protecting Oceania gathering of folks throughout the Pacific alongside the FESPAC activities. And while we were there, we discussed this question of what do we want our collective story to be in this world? And I posed this question to us today, and in the midst of this conversation and this report, this question of what is our story? What does a Pacific-centered approach that moves look like? An approach that respects multiple sovereignties, contradictions, political plurality, all while acknowledging the reality of colonialism and not just the legacy of colonialism, but as Ann Stoller describes, the contemporary imperial formations that continue to shape our lived realities. And this is something that Patrick also pointed out, right, that decolonization is not necessarily about independence, but about the kind of autonomy of decision-making regarding this nexus. And this is where we find ourselves now. According to Democracy Now!, the US is driving a global surge in nuclear weapons, noting that global spending has risen 13%, pushing spending to $91 billion in the last year alone on nukes. So how do we understand our role in these investments from the Pacific so we know what efforts not to support, and so that we also know where we can call out investments in other efforts that may appear to be good for us, but are actually foils for protecting nuclear power? Take, for example, the broad range of environmental protections in Micronesia, throughout Micronesia, that the military is often exempt from participating in under the blanket term national security. Or the role of conservation spaces in protecting or hiding nuclear submarines in plain sight. A Pacific-centered approach does something different, and it understands that these types of investments are cyclical investments in destruction rather than reciprocity. A core cultural tenet in many Pacific cultures. These investments are exacerbating inequitable political relationships, promoting political gray zones throughout the Pacific with larger powers, but are also working, and this is something that Patrick also just mentioned, right, is that they segment our islands from one another as concerns over which island nations side with which larger power lingers. So not to mention the toll on the environment in this zero-sum mentality is devastating as military budgets surge and environmental exemptions abound. These binaries present very real consequences for our people, including a reliance on militarization as a form of infrastructural investment, literally transforming our landscapes into insular environments for bases, landing strips, and other provocations. If we support spending more money on learning about the environment for the purpose of bombing it, or the purpose of assessing how much we can damage the environment before it becomes irreparable, it's probably time to reassess how these goals are in line with Pacific realities and what the insistence on restraint would look like for us. This is why, in this moment, amidst the growing surge of divestment strategies globally from war profiteers, we can look to answering this question by locating concretely how and where we want to divest from the growing military-industrial complex on our islands, which is working to uphold the surge of nuclear weapons in our waters and in the region. and it's often obfuscated by the media portrayals of AUKUS's network of nuclear-powered submarines as peace building in the Pacific. I wanted to touch briefly on key insight number 5 in the Navigating Nuclear Legacies project report regarding building trust and engagement in the Pacific. So we need to know what we're working with, because we can't reciprocate and engage in community care and trust without first engaging with the information about security that we're being fed, knowing that we as a community will be the ones to navigate our futures and aren't relying on anyone else to do the hard work for us. Working together at different scales and levels, yes, but the key is to parse out where the priorities lie so we know where we are going. In this regard, this is not just a question of media literacy, but also of data sovereignty, to maintain the integrity and the honesty of information to guide our decision-making as a Pacific collective. This way, we can start from a position of confidence and be realistic about our constraints in the Pacific while engaging with the guidance of our own intelligences, rather than starting from the perspective of being caught in the middle or stuck within a colonial mindset, as this report highlights. If we've learned, in closing, if we've learned anything from these discussions, it's that smallness has great power in the sense that it grounds us and we're able to speak on security issues from a place of humility, rooted in our unique cultural perspectives. And these ideas are more critical than ever amidst the grand and sweeping geopolitical narratives that are often built on the urgency of national allegiances that erase the deep political intelligences, and as Patrick and Maima both have pointed out, the humanization of the Pacific Islands. And this is a critical part of our stories. So I'll end with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Isa, for that powerful message and important points. I'll now hand over to Joanne Wallis for our final comments.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you, Maima and Patrick, for the presentations and Elaine for talking us through the report. And as you can obviously tell from my accent, I'm an Australian, so I am not speaking here today as a Pacific Islander, and I wouldn't want my comments to be taken that I was pretending to be able to speak for the region. But look, I can furiously agree with everything that has been said, because I do agree with everything that has been said, and I agree with everything that's in the report. But that's not particularly useful given, we've just heard it in far more expert terms than I'm able to give. So I think with my comments, what will be most useful is if I come at this from the perspective of Australia, which is, for better or worse, a very impactful partner state in the Pacific Islands region, and come up with some of the common questions and objections and concerns and easy outs that you often hear in the Australian debate, and that might be raised in response to the report and the presentations that we heard today. Now, Maima quite rightly, and I always agree with what Maima says, and Maima quite rightly emphasised the commonalities and the connections that are experienced in the Pacific. But I do find, and this is in my own work too, so there is often a tendency to speak about the Pacific as a collectivity that can sometimes obscure the diversity of the region. Thinking through scale here, we have Patrick here from Papua New Guinea, well over 8 million people, all the way down to the tiny populations in places like Tokelau and Niue. They do have, by necessity of size, geography, diplomatic relationships, their constitutional status, their sovereign status, different interests that can be sometimes subsumed by the title, the Pacific. And I note there that the different diplomatic relationships and their different constitutional relationships are really impactful. For better or worse, I think most of us probably here are reflexively in favour of decolonisation, would say for worse, but the US and France are there as colonial powers in the Pacific, and they do have an impact on Pacific solidarity and a sense of collectivity. In that regard, I think Patrick's comment about the fact that when he's teaching his students in Papua New Guinea, he often finds that he needs to educate them about different parts of the Pacific, and Patrick cited here the example of countries in Micronesia, does also represent the fact that we can assume when we use the term the Pacific that there is a sense of shared knowledge and understanding across the region that, again, may not be there. And I was really struck a few years ago when we had a workshop in Canberra about the geopolitics of the Pacific. And one of our speakers was Professor Ken Cooper from Guam, from the University of Guam. And Ken is a Chamorro man. And he was speaking about the push for self-determination and against US militarization of Guam. And I was quite struck in the response of many of the Pacific participants in that workshop to Ken's presentation, that there wasn't a sense of immediate solidarity with him. There was a comment by one quite prominent Pacific leader that, well, you know, you've got it, you know, in Guam, you've got pretty good healthcare. Look at your financial situation compared to what's happening, say, in parts of Melanesia. And it just exemplified for me that I think part of the Pacific moniker is needing to sort of unpack it and be aware of those tensions, because we can assume that there's a solidarity there and then go forward on that assumption, and it might not necessarily hold up. In that regard, you know, in Australia at least, there is a lot of talk about fragmentation in the Pacific and a lot of concern about fragmentation in the Pacific. And this was particularly the case when there was the potential split of the Pacific Islands Forum after the last election of Henry Puna as Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum. And that concern has continued, and a lot of it is generated by Australia and to a lesser extent New Zealand, because we are members of the forum. And it does raise that question about what forums can act as Pacific collectivities in geopolitical conversations and conversations about denuclearization when you have Australia and New Zealand at the table who have different interests. Now, New Zealand is not quite as far away as we are in Australia, but particularly on the nuclear issue, although we have a strong anti-nuclear movement in Australia, and I again have a lot of sympathy for that, we are not, the Australian government is not supporting denuclearization or the treaty in any time soon, because for us, our alliance with the United States is so central and so existential to the way we understand ourselves and our role in the world that we will never, in the foreseeable future, step away from that alliance, and that by necessity, that, you know, our reliance essentially on the US nuclear umbrella. And we've seen this amplified by, and Issa mentioned the AUKUS security partnership between Australia, the US, and the UK, our development of nuclear-powered, not nuclear-armed, thank goodness, but nuclear-powered submarines. And we can see it's not just Australia that is sometimes a fragmenting actor in the forum and in the Pacific. On the issue of Fukushima and the discharge of the Japanese discharge of nuclear waste, we've seen splitting in the Pacific. So we've seen, for example, Fijian Prime Minister Sitiveni Rabuka has been come out in favour, in support of Japan's discharge. I mean, notably, Rabuka also came out in support of the AUKUS security partnership and Australia's acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines. So again, it's just an example of the fact that we can't assume that there's a collective stance on a lot of issues. And just finally, Patrick mentioned decolonisation, and I think that's again another case where solidarity doesn't necessarily hold. I think most Pacific people would agree that decolonisation is important in principle, but we see in the example of West Papua that there is not a solidified regional position on West Papua. Vanuatu is extremely good on decolonisation generally, and particularly on the West Papua issue. But that is not necessarily the case for, say, Papua New Guinea on the West Papua issue. Now, Papua New Guinea has many reasons why that is the case, but it's just another example of the fact that there isn't yet necessarily Pacific regional solidarity that can then be translated into action with potential partners. The same goes with New Caledonia. There is more regional consensus among the island states about connect self-determination and support for that. But we don't see action really in the Pacific Islands Forum because, again, we have Australia and New Zealand at the table. And it is not foreseeable that Australia would support the self-determination of New Caledonia. You just need to look at a map and see where New Caledonia is relative to Australia and know the level of paranoia in Australia about China in the Pacific to know that the Australian government will never support a position where New Caledonia becomes independent and potentially becomes a security partner of China. So I'm not wanting to, as I said at the beginning of my comments, I agree with everything that has been said, and I could have just sat here and reiterated and furiously agreed with it. But I think it's helpful to think through some of the responses that will come from the more cynical or the more skeptical, because that then helps prepare the responses in turn to those objections and critiques. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Joanne. That was excellent. So now we have an opportunity for a little bit of a discussion. We are somewhat pressed for time, so we have 15 minutes, and we already have one question in the Q&A box, which was actually to Patrick. Patrick, I know that you answered the question, but I think for the benefit of others on this call who might not be able to see the response, I think it would be great if you could kind of speak to that here. I'll just read out the question so that everyone is aware, and then if you could speak to that, that would be wonderful. So that's the question was that you said that some Pacific Island states use the friends to all, enemy to none foreign policy orientation as a means to assert agency. But some would argue that it would undermine agency because it limits the extent to which a state or a group of states can put pressure on other states. So does this concept of agency in geopolitics not also imply a certain risk that one cannot always maintain friendships with all? That was the question. So Patrick, would you be able to speak to your answer to that question, please? I think Patrick might be frozen. Can you hear us, Patrick? Okay, maybe we'll put a pin in that question for now, and then hopefully Patrick will be able to rejoin us and answer that. So we have oh wait, Patrick is joining us now. Hello, Patrick. Are you able to hear me? Can you answer that question? Okay, we'll come back to Patrick in a bit. So on some other potential questions to the guest, maybe I will direct a question first to Elaine regarding the project. So let me just see, hang on a second. So one of the recommendations that was mentioned was to try and deepen engagement within the Pacific Islands, whilst also expanding dialogue across the wider Asia-Pacific region. How do you imagine this process unfolding? And should the dialogue within the Pacific Islands take place first before broadening out to the wider Asia-Pacific? And what role do you see APLN playing in this? So I'll put that to Elaine, and I might see if others might be interested in responding to that as well. So Elaine, please.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Shada. So I think these two conversations can happen simultaneously because there's no like definite end goal or threshold to hit for engagement and collaboration, I think. And perspectives and understandings will continue to evolve on these issues. So I think it's just crucial to actually have these conversations to build relationships and trust. And I think conversations within the Pacific on these issues, on security issues, are already increasing. For example, last December, the University of the South Pacific convened a Track 2 Pacific Dialogue on security and geopolitical issues, which I think brought together participants from across the Pacific region. So the gears are already in motion for that, I think. And as for APLN's role, since our network and the scope of our work, spans across the Asia Pacific, I think we can kind of be the bridge that connects the Pacific Islands and Asia, facilitating these engagements and conversations on security and shared security interests and Yeah, so I think that's what we're hoping to do next.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I have a question actually to Maima. So Maima, you spoke about the issue of how power and influence in the Pacific is an evolving concept and multidimensional. I'm wondering how could you speak to this issue a little bit more, and what more the Pacific Island countries can do to kind of assert themselves and their interests in the context of the US-China competition?
Thank you. So my comment really is from a cultural perspective in terms of that we don't view power in this notion of like military power or financial, like wealth. In terms of when I'm talking about cultural background, I'm talking about Tokelau and Samoa. Wealth of us is really about family relationship, about your networks. That's the measure for influence, and also for that's why power is and influence is multidimensional, because it's not pitched onto one thing. Depending on where you sit, depending on the context, depending on what is going on, different players are involved, and that actually defines the power dynamics of anything, whether it's foreign policy or anything else. So in terms of geopolitics, this is where I'm saying, like, to give an example, often like we kind of say whoever is providing the funding, whoever is involved in the funding element has got the power that, power over. Now we are engaged in research and work across the Pacific, and that's not necessarily the case, because what is often missed, what is often not acknowledged, is that your effectiveness on the ground relies on the relationship and the networks that people bring into what you're trying to do and what you're trying to achieve. And also you're relying on their knowledge, because they have the baseline knowledge to a large extent. So the power dynamics is not necessarily always about funding. This is where I come into that. And this is, so we are talking about power and influence in terms of geopolitics. And it's like, okay, who's having the strategic relationships? So we really need to ask the question about, well, how are you engaging with these countries? How are you engaging them? What are the contradictions in your engagement that is present, that actually it's not, it's not about the money? And we wrote a paper with Professor Joanne that we talked, the role of media was mentioned. Patrick talked about how Solomon Islands was ostracized. There's those commentary can be very negative. It can actually, while you're trying to build the relationships, people remember what has been said, what has been read about their leaders, this is why these things cannot ever be kind of assumed that it's linear, or that it has to be taken from another perspective as well, is where I was coming from with that.
Great, thank you. So I have a question for Isa, which is, given your work on these issues, what more, in your view, can be done to actually resist the perceived growing militarization in the Pacific region? And a question also for Joanne. So Joanne, how do you imagine moving forward? How do you envisage the evolving role of Australia in the region and its kind of relationship with countries there? And also, what can be done to arrest the perceived fragmentation, or to promote solidarity in the region? So I'll maybe turn to Isa first, and then go to Joanne. So Isa, please.
Yeah, thank you for that. So ironically, I guess, I don't know if that's quite the word, but in a lot of the demilitarization movements that we're seeing emerging, and all of the different kind of solidarities that are emerging in this kind of movement, it is helping us to actually connect in a lot of ways that we may not have otherwise. And in doing so, we're really, you know, these are moments for us to actually renegotiate things like political status or what our political relationship is with one another. And I say that because, for example, in between islands, right, we have two different political statuses in between a 45-minute plane ride between Guam and the CNMI, right? And so we are, you know, while we are dealing with the same impact of not the same, but very similar impacts of militarization across the entire archipelago, we're being challenged to think about what something like decolonization means across borders, right? Across these artificial borders. And so in that way, it's been really fruitful because it's again, it's allowing us to rethink what the political possibilities might be outside of, you know, mere discussions of political status, for example, and to help us reimagine the potential of what these relationships could look like. And then further out, you know, as we work with folks in the Philippines, for example, or Okinawa, right, we're getting to see and really witness you know, what a process like militarization is doing throughout the entire, you know, quote unquote, Indo-Pacific region. And so, again, these emergent solidarities are allowing us to rethink what our political possibilities can be in this moment. And so that's the silver lining in this discussion. And also to point to what Joanne had mentioned, right, it's true. It's also allowing us to see where we may not always be in alliance with one another, right? And maybe where we want to work out, you know, where we are on the same page and where our differences really maybe won't coalesce into a larger collective, as she mentioned. So just that kind of realistic dimension, I think, to the conversation is really important.
Great, thank you so much. And Joanne?
Thanks. Well, just briefly, I think, look, Australia has got a lot better, our policy in the Pacific, since we had a change of government in May 2022. So we are doing a lot more to listen. I think there's also a much more willingness to learn, not just to hear, but to actually learn and change. And our current Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, is really driving that change in the Australian government. So we are doing a lot better. That's not to say, of course, that we're perfect. And I think in terms of what the Pacific Island countries, if I were to give them advice, very reluctantly, but I think that part of managing Australia in the Pacific is recognising that Australia has interests well beyond the Pacific as well. So the Pacific is important to Australia, but those interests are always going to be offset against our broader strategic interests. And whether you agree with the balance or not, that is just the way it is. And you only need to see in Australia how we're throwing $368 billion at developing these nuclear-powered submarines. With governments, it's important to hear what they say, but it's also important to see where they direct their dollars. And that does tell you, no matter what they're saying, the dollars are telling you what they're really thinking. And I think the challenge, and I think this is, and I probably was being overly negative about Pacific collectivity, but I was just trying to be the devil's advocate. But I think it's for Pacific Island countries to really decide how they're going to manage Australia and France and the US, and not allow those countries to try to splinter their solidarity. And what worries me, and I've been saying this in my work before, is that all these bilateral security agreements that we're now seeing spring up. So the US with Papua New Guinea, for example, Australia has been the biggest proponent of bilateralism in security agreements in the Pacific. And I just worry that that is just going to undermine Pacific Island Forum and other Pacific regional efforts at security, at collective security. So I think it's for Pacific Island countries to accept Australia, the US, France, and others as they are, and think, how can we manage them? How can we restrain them? How can we avoid the temptations that sometimes come towards bilateralism with them to maintain our solidarity? And we saw, for example, the Samoan Prime Minister Fiame really led the charge against China's attempt at a sort of fragmenting regional agreement, but that was only with countries that had relations with China. And I think what Fiame said then about the importance of regional solidarity and regional agreements being addressed by the region and discussed by the region as a whole was really important. And I hope that spirit continues, and that Australia and others are managed, because we're not going to manage ourselves. Pacific Island countries need to manage us.
Excellent, thank you. And I see that Patrick has rejoined us, so I'll give Patrick the last word and an opportunity to speak to that question, Patrick, about the friends to all, enemies to none foreign policy orientation, if you don't mind. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay, I'm sure none of my enemies were actually connected with the disconnection I had with my Zoom. I think that this particular French wall enemies to none statement was made in reference, perhaps, these countries that are practicing the using it as rhetoric, as justification to engage with multiplicity of development partners, and of course the Solomon Islands, PNG, Vanuatu, even Fiji. They made reference to French wall enemies to none in the context of perhaps mediating. The general understanding is that if you are seen to be a friend to somebody, then you are enemy to another. So it's that binary kind of worldview and adversarial nature of, picking sides. And I think I'm speaking from a Melanesian perspective that that kind of like the role of mediating great power confrontations and misunderstanding. And I understand that small states, this is basically the default. We fall back on this particular small states in the Pacific. We can naturally fall back on French wall enemies to none, because obviously we don't want to be antagonizing anybody that's big and that will perhaps have more influence over us. So I think for practical purposes, speaking as a Melanesian, and our understanding of how to play, the benefits that you can get from different parties in a rivalry, perhaps that is much more useful in the context of how Melanesian states and even Pacific states can have the best of both worlds in this Sino-American rivalry. I guess that was.
Right. Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, everyone, for your very thoughtful and thought-provoking comments and contributions. We're actually over time now, so just to close the webinar and to offer just a final remark, we're facing a period of increasing geopolitical competition, and as discussed, growing militarization and militarism between the US and China in the Pacific Islands region and the broader Asia Pacific. And the engagement of these major powers with the Pacific Islands must be based on an understanding of the region's priorities and differences. And additionally, it's important to note that bridging the dialogue gap between the various Pacific Island nations, as well as with their Asian counterparts, is critical to really understanding how to best address the shared nuclear, climate, and other security risks faced across the Asia Pacific and globally. So we've had an extremely rich discussion, and you can find links to the project reports as well as to the reports that were referred to during this webinar in the chat, and also on the APLN website. If you have any further comments or questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you to all of our presenters and discussants. Thank you to those of you who joined this discussion and to the APLN staff who helped to organize this event. We very much look forward to staying connected with all of you, and we do hope that you have a great rest of your day. Goodbye, everyone, and thank you. Thanks, everyone.